The rope still creaked in the morning wind, its frayed end dancing like a snake above the weathered gallows. Samuel Carter stood beneath it, his calloused hands gripping his worn hat so tightly that his knuckles had turned white as bone. 3 months had passed since they'd hanged his boy Thomas here in the town square of Cedar Falls, but the old farmer returned every dawn, drawn by something he couldn't name and couldn't shake. The town was stirring to life around him. Shopkeepers swept dust from their porches, horses clip-clopped down the main street carrying supplies and travelers, and the familiar sounds of frontier life echoed off the false-fronted buildings. But Samuel heard none of it. In his mind, he was still watching his 25-year-old son climb those 13 steps, still seeing Thomas turn to look at him one last time with eyes that held no anger, only a terrible understanding. "You gonna stand there all morning again, Sam?" Sheriff Bill Morrison's voice cut through the memory like a rusty blade. Samuel turned slowly, his weathered face showing no emotion as he faced the lawman who had placed the noose around his son's neck. "Free country, Bill. Last I checked, a man could stand where he pleases." Morrison shifted uncomfortably, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his gun belt. At 62, he'd been keeping the peace in Cedar Falls for over 2 decades, but something about Samuel Carter these past months made him nervous. The farmer had always been quiet, but now there was something different in his silence, something that felt like a loaded gun waiting to go off. "Folks are starting to talk, Sam. Say you're not right in the head since what happened. Maybe it's time you accepted that your boy made his choice. Thomas robbed that bank, killed poor Henry Walsh in cold blood. Justice was served." Samuel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Justice." He repeated the word like it tasted of bitter medicine. "That what you call it?" Before Morrison could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. A cloud of dust rose from the eastern road as 3 riders thundered into town, their horses lathered with sweat and their faces grim with purpose. The lead rider wore a silver star pinned to his black vest, his hand already reaching for the warrant folded in his coat pocket. "That'd be Marshal Davies from Dodge City," Morrison muttered, straightening his shoulders. "Wonder what brings federal law to our little corner of Kansas." But Samuel already knew. As the marshal dismounted and strode toward them, his boots ringing against the wooden planks of the boardwalk, Samuel felt his heart begin to pound with a rhythm he recognized from that terrible night 3 months ago when everything had begun to unravel. "Sheriff Morrison?" Marshal Davies was a tall man with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much. "I'm here about the bank robbery that took place here in May. The one where Henry Walsh was killed." Morrison nodded, casting a quick glance at Samuel. "Thomas Carter. We caught him, tried him, and executed him fair and square. Case is closed, Marshal." "Is it?" Davies pulled out a telegram, its edges worn from handling. "Because we just arrested a man in Dodge City who's confessing to robbing banks all across Kansas. Claims he's responsible for more than a dozen jobs, including one here in Cedar Falls. Says there's been a terrible mistake." The color drained from Morrison's face, but Samuel felt something else entirely. For the first time in 3 months, the crushing weight in his chest began to lift, replaced by something that felt dangerously close to hope. "That's impossible," Morrison stammered. "We had witnesses. Evidence. Thomas Carter was caught red-handed with the money." "Were you?" Davies turned his penetrating gaze on Samuel. "You're the boy's father, aren't you? Samuel Carter?" Samuel nodded slowly, not trusting his voice. He'd dreamed of this moment, prayed for it during countless sleepless nights, but now that it was here, he found himself terrified of what it might mean. "Tell me, Mr. Carter, did your son ever say anything to you about that night? Anything that might help us understand what really happened?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Samuel felt every eye in the growing crowd upon him, felt the weight of 3 months of silence pressing down on his shoulders like a millstone. In his mind, he could hear Thomas's voice from their last conversation, could see his son's face twisted with anguish as he tried to explain something that made no sense at the time. "Pa, if something happens to me, you got to promise me something. You got to look after Mary. Don't let her blame herself for any of this. What I'm about to do, I'm doing because I love you both, and sometimes love means making choices that other folks won't understand. Samuel had thought his boy was talking nonsense, maybe drunk or spooked by something. He'd never imagined that within 24 hours, Thomas would be dead, hanged for a crime that Samuel now knew in his bones his son hadn't committed. "Mr. Carter?" Davies pressed gently. "Anything you can tell us might help clear your son's name." Samuel looked around at the faces surrounding him. There was Morrison, sweating despite the cool morning air. There was Reverend Matthews, who had refused to give Thomas a proper burial in the church cemetery. There was Mrs. Henderson from the general store, who had crossed herself every time she'd seen Samuel since the hanging. And there, standing in the shadows near the bank, was Jonathan Miller, the mayor's son, watching the proceedings with eyes that held something Samuel had learned to recognize as fear. Miller was 28 years old, the kind of man who wore expensive clothes and smiled too easily. He'd been one of the most vocal supporters of Thomas's swift execution, claiming that rough justice was the only kind that mattered on the frontier. But Samuel had noticed things about Miller that others hadn't. The way the young man's hands shook when he lit his cigarettes. The way he'd avoided looking directly at the gallows during the hanging. The way he'd started carrying a gun after Thomas's arrest, despite never having shown any interest in firearms before. Most telling of all was the way Miller watched Mary now, following her with his eyes whenever she came to town, always keeping his distance but never letting her get too far out of sight. It was the behavior of a man who was either lovesick or terrified, and Samuel had long since ruled out love. "My son," Samuel said finally, his voice carrying clearly across the square, was many things. He was stubborn, quick-tempered, and sometimes too eager to fight for what he thought was right. But he was no thief, and he was no murderer. Davies nodded encouragingly. "What makes you so certain?" Samuel felt the moment balanced on a knife's edge. He could tell the truth about what he suspected, about the pieces of the puzzle that had been slowly fitting together in his mind over the past 3 months. He could reveal his growing certainty that Thomas had died trying to protect his sister from something or someone. He could expose his belief that the real killer was standing not 50 feet away, hiding behind his father's influence and the town's eagerness to see justice done quickly. But he could also see Mary emerging from the boarding house where she worked, her young face still bearing the shadows of grief that had haunted her since Thomas's death. At 23, she'd already endured more sorrow than most women twice her age, and Samuel knew that whatever secret Thomas had died protecting was still a danger to her. "I know my son," Samuel said carefully, "the way a man knows the land he's worked for 30 years. You learn to read the signs, to understand what's beneath the surface. Thomas might have made mistakes, but stealing from neighbors and killing an innocent man wasn't in his nature. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was enough to make Davies nod thoughtfully. We'll be conducting a full investigation, Mr. Carter. If your son was innocent, we'll prove it. And if someone else is responsible for Henry Walsh's death, we'll find them." As the marshal turned to speak with Morrison about reopening the case, Samuel felt a presence beside him. He looked down to see Mary approaching, her blue dress simple but clean, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun. She was beautiful in the way of frontier women, with a strength that showed in her posture and an intelligence that sparkled in her green eyes. "Pa," she said quietly, taking his arm. "What's happening? Why is there a federal marshal here?" Samuel covered her hand with his own, feeling how cold her fingers were despite the warming day. "They think maybe Thomas didn't do what they said he did. They're going to look into it again." Mary's face went pale, and Samuel felt her grip tighten on his arm. "Oh, Pa! What if they find out about—" She stopped herself, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "Find out about what, honey?" But Mary just shook her head, her lips pressed together in a line that reminded Samuel painfully of his late wife. "Nothing, Pa. Just, what if digging all this up again just makes things worse? What if it doesn't bring Thomas back but just causes more pain for everyone?" Samuel studied his daughter's face, seeing fear there that went deeper than simple grief. In that moment, he understood with crystalline clarity that Mary knew something too, something that connected to the secret Thomas had died protecting. The realization hit him like a physical blow, and he had to steady himself against the gallows post. "Mary, he said gently, "what aren't you telling me?" But before she could answer, a commotion near the bank drew their attention. Jonathan Miller was arguing with Marshal Davies, his voice raised just enough to carry across the square. "This is ridiculous, Marshal. Thomas Carter was guilty as sin, and everyone in this town knows it. Reopening this case is just going to stir up trouble and pain for everyone involved. Sometimes the law gets it right the first time." Davies regarded Miller with the kind of steady look that made guilty men sweat. "Mr. Miller, isn't it? You seem awfully concerned about a case that's already been closed. Most folks would want to see justice done, even if it means admitting a mistake was made." Miller's face reddened. "Of course I want justice. But I also want peace for this community. We've moved on from that terrible night. Why drag everyone back through it?" "Because," Davies said quietly, "if an innocent man died on that gallows, then a guilty one is still walking free. And that's not something any decent community should have to live with." Samuel watched the exchange with growing certainty. Miller's protests were too vehement, his concern too pointed. This was not the behavior of a man who simply wanted to preserve community peace. This was the behavior of a man who was terrified of what an investigation might uncover. As the crowd began to disperse and Davies prepared to begin his investigation, Samuel made a decision that he knew would change everything. He had spent 3 months in silence, paralyzed by grief and uncertainty. But now, with the possibility of Thomas's innocence being proven, he could no longer remain passive. He would find the truth about what happened that night, whatever the cost. He would discover what secret Thomas had died protecting, and he would see that real justice was finally served. And if that justice required him to confront powerful men and dangerous truths, then so be it. The sun was climbing higher in the Kansas sky, promising another scorching day on the frontier. But Samuel Carter no longer felt the heat. He felt only the cold fire of determination burning in his chest, and the growing certainty that before this day was over, the carefully constructed lies that had cost his son his life would finally begin to crumble. The truth, he knew, was out there waiting to be found. And he intended to find it, no matter what graves he had to dig up in the process. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the dusty windows of Samuel's farmhouse as he sat at his kitchen table, staring at the small leather journal he'd found hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Thomas's room. His hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages, reading his son's careful handwriting by the failing light. The entries began innocuously enough, documenting farm work and weather patterns, but as Samuel read deeper, a darker picture emerged. Thomas had been tracking someone's movements, noting times and places with the precision of a man conducting surveillance. The final entry, dated just 2 days before the bank robbery, made Samuel's blood run cold. "He's getting bolder. Followed em again today. She doesn't know, but I see how scared she gets when he's around. Found out why. God help us all, but I know what he did to her. What he's still threatening to do. There's only one way to stop a man like that. Tomorrow night, I end this." The sound of approaching footsteps on the porch made Samuel quickly close the journal. Mary appeared in the doorway, her face pale and drawn, carrying a basket of eggs from the henhouse. "Pa, I saw Marshal Davies leaving town earlier. He was asking questions at the boarding house about that night." "About me?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "What if he finds out?" Samuel stood slowly, his joints creaking like old leather. "Mary, you need to tell me what Thomas was protecting you from. I found his journal." The basket slipped from Mary's hands, eggs shattering against the wooden floor in a mess of shells and yolk. She stared at the wreckage for a long moment before meeting her father's eyes, and Samuel saw in them the same desperate fear that had haunted Thomas's face in his final days. "Jonathan Miller," she whispered. He forced himself on me last winter when I was working late at the mayor's house. When I threatened to tell, he said no one would believe me. Said he'd make sure everyone in town knew I was a loose woman. But that wasn't the worst of it." Samuel felt rage building in his chest like a prairie fire. "What else?" "There's a baby, Pa Jonathan's baby. I've been hiding it with the widow Patterson outside town. She's been caring for him while I work. Thomas found out, and he was going to make Jonathan pay. But Jonathan threatened to kill the child if Thomas said anything. That's why Thomas never defended himself at the trial. He was still protecting us, even with the noose around his neck. The pieces of the puzzle suddenly locked into place with devastating clarity. Samuel understood now why Thomas had been found with the stolen money, why he'd never spoken in his own defense, why Jonathan Miller had been so eager to see the case closed quickly. Thomas hadn't robbed the bank. He'd caught Miller in the act and taken the money to force a confession, but something had gone wrong. The real murderer had let an innocent man hang to protect his own reputation and his father's political career. Through the window, Samuel could see dust rising on the road to town. Marshal Davies was returning, and behind him rode Sheriff Morrison and several other men. But there was something wrong with the way they were approaching, something that made Samuel's instincts scream danger. "Mary, get to the root cellar. Now!" As his daughter disappeared through the trapdoor behind the stove, Samuel heard the thunder of hooves in his yard. But these men weren't coming for justice. Jonathan Miller rode with them, and the guns in their hands weren't drawn for protection. Samuel Carter realized with cold certainty that his quiet investigation had been discovered, and that the men who had killed his son were now coming to silence him too. The truth he'd fought so hard to uncover might die with him in this isolated farmhouse, unless he could find a way to survive long enough to reveal it to the world. The journal still lay open on the table, Thomas's words of love and sacrifice stark on the yellowed page. Samuel picked up his old Colt revolver from the mantelpiece, checked the chambers, and prepared to make his stand. His son had died protecting family. Now it was Samuel's turn to do the same. The standoff lasted only seconds, but to Samuel it felt like hours. Through his kitchen window, he could see Sheriff Morrison's face twisted with something between guilt and desperation, while Jonathan Miller sat his horse with the arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. Behind them, 3 other men Samuel recognized as Miller's usual companions held rifles with the casual ease of those accustomed to violence. "Samuel Carter," Morrison called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "We need to have a word with you about some disturbing allegations that have come to light." Samuel stepped onto his porch, his Colt hanging loose at his side. "I imagine you do, Bill. Though I suspect the word you're looking for isn't one you want the whole county to hear." Miller's horse pranced nervously as its rider leaned forward in his saddle. "This doesn't have to end badly for you, Carter. Just hand over whatever papers or evidence you think you have, and we can all go home peacefully." "Evidence?" Samuel allowed himself a bitter smile. Funny how guilty men always assume other folks are collecting evidence against them. Makes a person wonder what they're so afraid of. The sound of approaching hoofbeats from the main road made everyone turn. Marshal Davies rode hard toward the farmhouse, his face grim with purpose. Behind him came 2 federal deputies and, to Samuel's surprise, the widow Patterson carrying a small bundle that could only be Mary's child. Miller's face went white as prairie snow. "This is a private matter, Marshal. Family business." "Murder is federal business when it crosses state lines," Davies replied, dismounting with fluid grace. "Especially when we've got a confession from the real bank robber and testimony from Mrs. Patterson here about threats made against an infant child." The widow stepped forward, her weathered face resolute. "I've kept silent long enough, Marshal. This baby belongs to Mary Carter, and Jonathan Miller is the father. He's been threatening to kill the child if the truth ever came out. That's why young Thomas never defended himself. He was protecting his sister and this innocent boy." Samuel felt the weight of 3 months of silence lifting from his shoulders. "Marshal, there's something else you need to know. The man you executed wasn't the bank robber, but he died because he caught the real thief in the act. Thomas found Miller coming out of that bank with blood on his hands and Henry Walsh's money in his saddlebags." "That's a lie." Miller's voice cracked like a whip across the yard. "Thomas Carter was caught red-handed. Everyone knows it." "Everyone knows what you wanted them to know," Samuel said quietly. "But the truth has a way of surfacing, like bodies in a river. Thomas took that money from you, didn't he? He was going to use it as evidence, force you to confess. But you were smarter than that. You let him be found with it, let the whole town assume he was the thief. All you had to do was keep quiet and watch an innocent man hang. Davies had his gun drawn now, pointing it steady at Miller. Jonathan Miller, you're under arrest for the murder of Henry Walsh and the wrongful death of Thomas Carter. You can't prove anything. Miller snarled, but his hand was already moving toward his gun. The shot that rang out across the farmyard didn't come from Miller's weapon or Davies' gun. It came from Samuel's old Colt, and it took Miller clean in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle to land hard in the dust. "That's for my boy," Samuel said, his voice steady as stone. "The man in that grave isn't an outlaw. He's my son, and he died protecting his family from a snake like you." As Davies' deputies moved in to secure Miller and his companions, Sheriff Morrison sat his horse like a broken man. "Sam, I swear I didn't know. I thought we had the right man." Thomas never said anything, never tried to defend himself. He couldn't. Mary's voice came from the porch as she emerged from the house, her eyes fixed on her child in the widow Patterson's arms. Jonathan told him that if he said one word about what really happened, he'd kill the baby and make sure I was branded as a whore from here to California. Thomas chose to die rather than risk our lives. Samuel walked to his daughter and took her in his arms, feeling her shoulders shake with 3 months of suppressed grief and fear. Behind them, Marshal Davies was reading Miller his rights while the wounded man clutched his shoulder and cursed through gritted teeth. The sun was setting over the Kansas plains, painting the sky the color of blood and gold. In a few hours, word would spread throughout Cedar Falls that justice had finally been served, that an innocent man's name had been cleared and a guilty one brought to account. There would be a new grave in the churchyard, this one bearing Thomas Carter's real name and the truth about how he died. But for now, Samuel Carter stood on his porch holding his daughter and grandchild, watching as the men who had destroyed his family were led away in chains. The weight of silence was gone, replaced by something he hadn't felt since that terrible day in May. It felt like peace.